And with that, let's jump into the content. So quickly, let's cover, my mouse works, who the heck we are. So instead of just being disembodied voices, I wanted to put a face to the name and introduce the Domestic Violence Response Department. Doreen?
Hello, good morning.
Doreen is our Domestic Violence Response Manager.
Hi, this is Samantha. I'm one of the Domestic Violence Response Coordinators along with Ruby. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
That's our great Samantha. And then the person you're hearing right now is Ruby. My name is Ruby and my pronouns are she, her, hers, ella, and I'm also one of the Domestic Violence Response Coordinators here at the Coalition. So we're a small but mighty team of 3, and we're really excited to be here today. So all 3 of us are going to be sharing and helping out in some way for this webinar. So I will have our contact information on the very last slide of this presentation. So if you're willing to, or if you need to get in contact with us, you will be able to. All right, let's talk about objectives. So we will, hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll be able to define what domestic violence is and describe its legal context, especially in Arizona. We'll discuss common tactics of power and control that responsible parties use. We'll explore theories for causes of domestic violence and their meaning to advocacy. We'll recognize the potential barriers that survivors might face in seeking help. And we'll describe qualities of good partner violence intervention programs. So, quickly though, I did want to, since many of us might not be perhaps directly in the domestic violence or field, or might be an advocate, you might be in another role or capacity in something in a different field, I wanted to clarify what the role of a state coalition is. First, every state and territory in the United States has a coalition designated specifically for domestic and sexual violence. Those organizations are nonprofits, they're non-governmental, and depending on which state you're looking at, you might have 2 separate coalitions. So you might have a domestic violence coalition, you might have a sexual assault coalition. Some states are pretty lucky that they have dual coalitions, and we're one of them. So we are the Arizona Coalition to End Both Sexual and Domestic Violence. So we're pretty lucky. We became a dual organization back in
November 2013.
November of 2013, if we're getting specific. Our role in the community is to advocate for comprehensive responses for domestic and sexual violence survivors at the local, state, and national levels. And we are the primary provider of training and technical assistance for programs on best practices in programming and administration, and we advocate on behalf of programs and survivors in public policy advocacy efforts. So we do have a wonderful public policy specialist on our staff who develops an agenda every year that she takes down to the legislature to get hopefully some of these bills passed. We also advocate for bills. We advocate against bills that we deem might be helpful for survivors or hurtful to their safety. And we also advocate for budgets as well to make sure our programs have the adequate funding to remain open and to keep helping survivors every day. And our mission did also change when we became a dual organization, and that is to end sexual and domestic violence by dismantling oppression and promoting equity. We'll talk about what that has to do with violence shortly, because I get sometimes confused faces when I tell them, you know, oppression and equity are really tied to social justice, domestic and sexual violence, and yeah, we'll clarify that in a minute. All right, so let's talk about basics. So at the Coalition, we kind of look at domestic violence as being this umbrella term or umbrella kind of term that we look at, where there's many different forms of violence that could be considered domestic violence. For one, Many of you might have heard the term family violence. It's become a little bit more popular now. You know, certain police departments are now adopting family violence units where they cover topics like this and cases that involve families, children, and all of that. You might see child abuse under this umbrella too, depending on who you ask. Definitely if that child is being mistreated or neglected by a parent, a sibling, you know, a family member. Same thing for elder abuse. If an elder citizen is being abused or neglected by a family member or relative. Teen dating violence, absolutely. There's many great organizations devoted to working with teens and unpacking these issues, and really more of the prevention piece that we're looking at. But that would be considered a form of domestic violence too. Animal abuse, we can't forget our pets. We're doing a lot of good work here at the Coalition related to animals and animal abuse specifically. It's one of our initiatives to really help lower those barriers for survivors who are needing safety but might not want to leave their pets behind in an abusive environment. So we're doing good work there. Stalking, definitely, as it relates to domestic violence. I know many survivors that I worked with in the past who have been stalked by their intimate partner. And I mean, that's another tactic that we're looking at for sure. And then intimate partner sexual violence. We know that being in an intimate relationship, being married, you can still be sexually assaulted, you can still be sexually harassed. So looking at that specific kind of area would also be considered domestic violence. And then lastly, what we tend to think of domestic violence being the most, or this is kind of the image that we get when we say domestic violence, is intimate partner violence. And that is a subset of domestic violence where we're just looking at violence between intimate partners. So that could be married folks, folks who are dating, people in intimate relationships. And then at the Coalition, we describe or define domestic violence a certain way, where domestic violence is a pattern of abusive or coercive behaviors in any intimate or familial relationship that are used to gain and maintain power and control over another person. And we'll kind of break up what these phrases mean. What is power and control? What constitutes an intimate relationship? What does it mean, for a pattern of behavior to exist? But that is kind of, in a nutshell, how we define domestic violence. When we look at the legal definition, specifically in Arizona, that our state didn't pass a statute addressing domestic violence until 1980. So it hasn't been that long. It's not that old that we've had this statute on the books. It's relatively new if we think about it. Some of us are older than this law. And that statute is ARS 13-3601. And we consider that a tag crime in Arizona. So I will go ahead and share. We have a list of the crimes enumerated in the statute that we will share with all of you. But what a tag crime is essentially is there's a list of crimes that are involved in this law. And so I can't be technically arrested for domestic violence. I can't be charged with that crime. What it would be considered is depending on what crime I committed. So let's say if I assaulted my partner, the crime would be assault. And then because my relationship with the, the plaintiff in this case, it would be, or the victim, my relationship falls under one of the covered categories under the law, then that relationship makes it a tag crime now. So because this was my romantic partner that I assaulted, the crime would be assault, and then the domestic violence tag would be added because this was my romantic partner. So when I say relationship, it has to meet specific relationship criteria in order for it to be considered domestic violence legally. So those categories are being current or former spouses, having children in common, being pregnant by the other party, or the other party is pregnant by you, being related by blood or marriage. So this would cover in-laws, step families, stepchildren, all of that. Current or former cohabitants, fancy word for roommates. And then lastly, our current or former dating or sexual partners. Now this last category was actually an amendment to the law that was passed in 2009. So very, very new, this new category that we've had. And we had been trying at the coalition to get this category amended to 13-3601 for about 5 years. And unfortunately, it took a tragedy in our state where a teen girl was killed by her high school boyfriend, that it really opened up the eyes of our state legislators. So fortunately, now we have that category in place where if you are dating someone, if you have a sexual relationship with that person, you can still seek safety, and the law will protect you. And that, yeah, it includes teens, because unfortunately that the victim in that case where she was killed didn't fall under any of these other categories, right? She wasn't married to her boyfriend, they didn't have kids, she wasn't pregnant, they didn't live together, they weren't related. So she kind of fell through the cracks there. So yeah, and Sam just mentioned too, and this is the key piece here, the relationship test is really important to understand, because these categories are the same for getting an order of protection in Arizona. So if you are seeking an order of protection, and want to file one, you have to meet these same relationship tests or categories in order to get a judge to grant that. So good information to know that those are the same. So to make it a little more visually clear, right, we need to have the crime, one of the enumerated crimes in the law, as well as meet one of the relationship categories for it to be legally considered domestic violence. I know this is kind of overly simplistic, but we need those two things to happen in order for the state to consider that domestic violence. All right. Now we get asked a lot, right? Who are victims? Who are they? Where are they? What kind of characteristics, does a victim have? Can I, walk out on the street and identify one really easily? And I'm hoping we can clarify some of those myths, perhaps, by the end of this presentation. So we know, right, just statistically speaking, domestic violence can happen to anyone. It doesn't discriminate based on your gender, what race you are, your ethnicity, your religion, what age you are, who you love, your class status, what education level you are, what your ability status is, your legal status, none of that. It really can happen to anyone. We always say at the coalition that domestic violence is a gender neutral crime, meaning it can happen to both men and women, as well as non-binary folks, but it's not gender equal. And that's something I really want to make sure we understand, is most of the people who are arrested and sentenced for domestic violence crimes are men. And that's something we have to contend with, and there's a lot of layers to that as well that we'll get into later. But we know too, victims don't possess a set of universal characteristics or personality traits, right? They're not all one type of person, or they're not all, sensitive or weak or, helpless, beings that need our rescue. They're very multidimensional, like you and I are. A lot of them have strengths and resources within them already. And it's really up to us to not come with assumptions when we are working with victims. Also, they're not easily recognized because they're not typically covered in marks or bruises. And if there are injuries, victims have often learned to conceal those injuries, right? They don't want to be detected or raise suspicion. And sometimes being a victim is a shameful thing. And, covering up those things is a way to avoid those things from happening. And we know victims are often blamed or stigmatized for the abuse that's happened to them. Unfortunately, we live in a world where that is still occurring to this day, where victims are blamed for what's happened to them or for what someone else has done to them, which makes it a lot harder for them to access help, right? If there's that shame attached, if no one is believing you, it's much, much harder to reach out and get someone to assist you, to support you during these times, because it makes you think, right, that you're either making it up, you're not worthy of help, you're not worthy of justice. So it's really up to us as everyday people, right? When we go back home, when we talk to our friend circles, when we're, talking at the water cooler at work, and these sorts of issues come up, we interrupt that victim blaming when it occurs. It's really on all of us to make sure we do that. Oh, so a shameless plug here. We will also be hosting a Interrupting Victim Blaming webinar at the end of April. I think it's the last Monday in April, I believe. So if you're interested, we'll be sure to send out the registration link for that webinar, where we really do a deep dive into what victim blaming is, how it hurts survivors, and how we can ultimately interrupt it when it occurs. So we will send that out for sure. All right, so when we look at victims, right, we talked about who victims are. I did state that victims are multidimensional, right? Just like you and I are, we have many characteristics about ourselves, our personality traits, our struggles, our family histories. Same goes with perpetrators, right? They can be anyone, just as domestic violence can happen to anyone. Those who cause harm can be anyone too. They can be any gender, race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, class status, education level, ability status, legal status, any one of those things. They can really be anyone. And one myth that we get, that we have to kind of address when we're out in the community doing trainings is that perpetrators aren't like werewolves where, the full moon comes out and then they turn into different, beings, that are causing all this violence. They're not always angry. They're not always hostile. Actually, they can be quite charming, agreeable, and kind. But they all differ in patterns of abuse and levels of dangerousness, absolutely. But they do have some things in common. Clearly, right, obviously, they abuse their power in the relationship. They tend to have different public and private behavior, back to kind of that idea where, they're not werewolves that come out at night. Sometimes they treat their significant others or their family members a specific way where they might not be treating their boss the same way. They tend to project blame, minimize or deny the abuse, and they rarely take responsibility. We'll talk at the very end about ways we can address, right, or be involved in this work where we're working with those who cause harm to avoid these things from happening, and what does true accountability look like. But that's usually the case with people who choose to cause harm, right, and perpetrate domestic violence, is that they rarely take accountability for their actions. So, but that's not to say, though, that perpetrators don't need help either. Just as we have done as a movement a really good job of, focusing our efforts on the victims, right? It's usually after the fact, right? After a violent episode has happened, or, we've gotten to this point where we're now reacting to the violence in our society. We've done a really poor job, though, of involving those who are responsible for committing these crimes. So that's just a call on us. I think we need to do better as a movement to involve and collaborate with those who cause harm, because they need support and intervention too to end those violent behaviors and any additional problems that compound that behavior, whether that's a mental illness, addiction, maybe they're living in poverty, they're unemployed, all these things that might be adding to the situation or to their behavior. We need to address those things too.
I just want to add that the support and intervention for people who do harm needs to be separate from services for the victim. Couples counseling, marriage counseling, those kind of things just put victims more in danger.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Doreen. All right. Let's quickly look at prevalence statistics. So I mentioned earlier that we know domestic violence is not a gender equal crime, right, or problem. As you can see here, right, it happens more so to women than it does to men, but it does happen to men. That's really, I want to make clear that men can be abused, and it's usually, I would venture to guess that this, the male statistic here should be a lot higher than it is, but we know the way we're socializing men, you know, being called a victim or admitting that you've been victimized in some way, there's a lot of stigma and shame attached to that. And we know, you know, surveys are not perfect either. So there's definitely more people who weren't surveyed in this project that might be reporting abuse also. So, but this is the current information we have, the current statistics we work with is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men were victims of contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner that left them a negative impact, like having an injury, being afraid, being concerned for their safety, or needing some kind of support, advocacy, legal help, etc. We know too, domestic violence and issues of violence in general, and this goes back to why equity is so important. We know there is a very deep racial and ethnic disparity when we talk about violence. Time and time again, year after year, the statistics for violence that affect Native American women and American Indian women are higher than the rest of the racial and ethnic groups. It's about 50% of Native American women have experienced some form of violence, specifically intimate partner violence, in their lifetime. And I think I was reading up the other day on this study that upwards of like 80% of Native American women have been exposed to violence in some way. So it goes back to we need to have our services be racially equitable and really understand and contend with the history and the legacy of colonization, genocide, all these things that have been inflicted on our Native American folks to really make sure we're doing good work. I also wanted to talk about our gender and sexual orientation folks, right? Our transgender and gender nonconforming folks also experience violence at much higher rates than, you know, cisgender and gender conforming folks. So they experience intimate partner violence at the rates of either 30 to 50%, depending on the study we're looking at. Again, much higher than other rates of violence. So again, goes back to making sure our services are as equitable as possible. All right, let's talk about common tactics of abuse and control. So some of you might have seen this wheel before, right? It's very popular in the domestic violence movement. Our pretty little power and control wheel. So I blew up kind of the tactics here on the screen here so they're easier to read, but those things can include things like emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, or blaming, misusing technology, misusing privilege, intimidating someone, threatening, using threats, economic abuse. All those things would be considered domestic violence, right? Or behaviors that fall in line, right, with misusing power and control or trying to control someone else. So we won't go through each and every one of these tactics, but I did want to highlight some key points here. So in the light purple, right, the pie pieces, if you will, all of these things a person can do to someone else without ever touching them, right, without ever laying a finger on them, right? I can threaten you, I can call you names, I can steal your money, I can isolate you, right? I can try to pick fights with your friends and family. I can make you feel less than just because you're not white or not a man, or you're not of the same class as I am. I can try to steal your social media passwords. all those things I could do to someone and not ever be physically violent towards them. And that's something we have, I think, done a poor job of, right, in the media and in the movies, where we depict domestic violence as just being physical. And we really do a disservice when we believe that or assume that. And we miss out on helping so many people who don't ever experience physical or sexual violence, but they are still being controlled in some way, right? Their relationship isn't healthy, or they're being emotionally abused. So I really want to make that clear, that all these things can happen and it's still considered domestic violence. It's still considered abuse. We still should take it very seriously, right? It's still not something someone deserves to live in. And that's our role, right, as advocates, is to help understand the nuances in that relationship to be able to help support that individual, right? It shouldn't take broken arms and black eyes and, you know, a visit to the ER for us to now get involved, right? So it really is on us to believe people when they say, you know, something's not right. I don't feel valued. I don't feel like I'm an equal in my relationship. You know, something isn't right. Right? That's really a red flag for us to know, right? There's something else here that's going on where it might not rise to physical or sexual violence, right? And all these things really do have in common that power and control, right? That's why power and control is in the middle. These are all forms of misusing your power or trying to control someone else. So not good things, right, to have in our relationship. But I just wanted to make that very clear. And to drive home the point a little bit more, there's different forms of violence that still can be considered domestic violence that doesn't involve physical violence, right? We talked about animals at the beginning, where animals, there's a very big correlation between animals being mistreated and their humans being mistreated too, if there's an abusive person in the home. Things like unlawful imprisonment, right? Holding someone hostage, not letting them leave a room or their home, kidnapping someone. So I have here a picture of a phone because in the state of Arizona, it is a chargeable offense to take someone's phone away in an emergency, right? Not letting them call for help. So that is something good to know. Kidnapping, you know, it isn't just throwing someone in the trunk of the car and then driving across the country. It can be, you know, holding someone in a confined space and not letting them call for help could be a form of kidnapping too. Exploitation. So for those of you who might think of the movie Taken, when you hear exploitation, right? Liam Neeson in Europe trying to find his daughter's kidnappers. It's not usually the case where, you know, something that Hollywood happens, but exploitation can still happen in intimate relationships, right? Or in family relationships, excuse me, where someone can be exploited either sexually or for their labor. And it doesn't have to involve this, you know, intricate, elaborate, you know, exploitation or, you know, ring of like this operation where this is happening. It could simply be, hey, you know, I owe my buddy some money, so, you know, he just said you could sleep with him and he'll call it even, right? That's a form of exploitation that's important for us to understand as advocates. That can happen, does happen, unfortunately, and it's something to be aware of too. Rape, absolutely. I mentioned this at the beginning, right? Sexual violence can still occur in the context of intimate relationships, as well as sexual and reproductive coercion. We do a whole separate training on both of these issues because they are very nuanced and they're very subtle forms of violence. So it's important we understand, right? We shouldn't expect bruises and broken arms. That there's a lot of things that might be happening still, a lot of subtle things that are usually hard to pick up on, but can still feel really, you know, put someone in a really hard place in terms of, you know, not feeling trapped, so to speak, or feeling controlled in some way. So again, I will reiterate that an individual can still be abusive and not be physically violent. So I have a kind of a rhetorical question here, but when does a relationship become abusive? We get asked this a lot. You know, where is that line? Where does it now become abuse, right? And that's really not up to me to decide. That's for the survivor to decide, right? That's for the person who's enduring this kind of treatment, who's being harmed in this way. They get to decide, right? Hey, this isn't right anymore. This doesn't feel good. I don't feel, supported. I don't feel okay. This behavior is hurting me in some way. So it's really on us, and I'll give the call out to advocates here. We shouldn't be imposing our own values and belief systems on the people we're working with, right? We might have ideas of what's unhealthy behavior, what's abusive behavior, right? We might know the power and control wheel in and out. We might know all the tactics. But when we meet with a survivor, right, we don't know their life history. We don't know their relationship. They're the ones that get to decide, right? What feels good, what doesn't feel good, right? What's healthy, what's not healthy. And really follow their lead, okay? So again, right, it's not on us to judge or to assume, right, that, oh, because he calls you this name or because she treats you this way, that's abuse, right? We can drive away a lot of people that way, a lot of survivors that way. So it's really on us to really not be judgmental and come at it with a place of trying to understand and trying to learn from the survivor and how you can best support them. All right. Now for this section, we are getting a little academic, we're getting theoretical, but we always get asked on numerous occasions, what causes domestic violence? What what drives domestic violence in our society? Why do we struggle with this issue now in 2020? Why are these things still happening? There's a lot of theories out there as to what gives rise to these issues, especially issues of gender-based violence. So we'll cover a few here. And again, these are theories. So I see truth in every single one of them. You might not, or you might say, oh, this one makes more sense than this one, and that's okay, right? Theories at the end of the day are not, direct causes. We're not, saying for a fact this causes this. These are just ideas that support this idea that, these things cause domestic violence. So first, let's talk about the feminist perspective. Feminism is not a dirty word, but it has a lot of good, they've done a lot of good research in terms of feminism and patriarchy in our society. And we know that violence against women specifically is a result of being in a patriarchal society, right? And the way our society has been designed, right, for the benefit of, by men, and the unequal distribution of power that has historically oppressed women. And we've come to understand, right, where masculinity is associated with being powerful, being authoritative, and having control over women. And where male violence towards women is connected to that devaluation of women, right? And it makes sense. If I mistreat you, if I harm you or abuse you in some way, it's usually because I don't think of you as being on my level, right? I don't see you as being as human as I am, right? I see you as less than, so that kind of gives me the okay to treat you a different way, right? And we know there are many cases too where men may use violence to reassert their masculinity. So a good example of this, right, is not necessarily tied to male violence towards women, but let's say you're at a bar, right? And, a guy bumps into you, right? And you're another guy. That could be considered a threat to your masculinity. So we see bar fights and gang fights and all those things are really good examples of this, where men use violence to reassert their dominance, right? And their masculinity. So it goes beyond just male violence towards women, but it goes back to how we've set up our society, right? Who it benefits, and how we're socializing our men and boys to believe some of these things, right? To have these belief systems where women are viewed as less than, or those who are feminine are viewed as less than. Now let's talk about social learning. So for those of you who have worked with little ones or have a history in psychology, you might remember this theory, right, from Bandura and his Bobo doll experiment. I have here some clips from his original study. So you can see kind of the violence that this little boy is inflicting on an inanimate object, right, the Bobo doll. But what this theory talks about is that new behaviors are acquired by observing and imitating others, right? So when we kind of talk about violence in this, for this theory, violence is learned via role models in the family and the community. And through observation, imitation, and practice, a person who witnesses violence enacted by another person, usually a role model in that person's family, learns to wield violence as a tool and a language. And the use of violence becomes normalized, right? If this is how I grew up, if this is how, you know, mom and dad treated each other, this is how I saw the neighbors talk to each other, this is just what the community, you know, this is how we got along, right? The violence was a normal part of, you know, my life. They don't think twice, right? That this is something that's unacceptable, right? Or that they shouldn't be, that this isn't something that someone should accept. But the good news here, though, because we know violence is learned, it can be unlearned, right? And that really does take changes to our social structures and the conditions that shape us all. So that's the silver lining here, is that we don't have to accept this kind of thing anymore. We can unlearn these learned behaviors. All right. Next theory is the intergenerational transmission of violence. So we hear this a lot as like the generational cycle of violence. You might have heard that term being used. It's kind of the same idea here, where it occurs when an adult who's been exposed to violence as a child grows up, right, acts out violently, and negatively influences another child's development, right? Maybe their child is now learning the same behavior or is witnessing the violence that they're using, and that inadvertently increases their likelihood of using violence in adulthood. So think of it as like, you know, if mom and dad are violent and I grow up in that environment, I grow up thinking, hey, that's just how things are done. I have my own children, I act out those same behaviors, and that child's development is now affected, right? My child's development is affected, and it just continues, right? But we know the greatest predictor of violence is surviving it. A lot of people who have been incarcerated or, you know, sentenced for violent crimes have reported, right? This all started because I survived it in some way at the beginning, right? I was exposed to it as a child. I was abused growing up. You know, I was a victim of a crime myself. And then that kind of led me down this path, right? And we know being abused as a child puts someone at greater risk of either harming their partner or being abused as adults, right? So it can go either way. And we know just as a society, right, violence itself drives violence. So it's really on us to really understand how these things operate and where we can interrupt it. And it does really take a lot of work in every kind of form and capacity to stop these things from happening. All right. Back to our little ones, right? For those of you who work with little kids or have kind of an early childhood education or training or psychology training, you might remember attachment and attachment theory, where attachment refers to that early bond an infant develops with a caretaker that later forms the working model for future attachments and interactions. So growing up, right, in an environment, especially as infants and, you know, in the birth to 5 kind of range, if we experience abuse, inconsistency, or rejection from a primary caretaker, that disrupts our attachment. We later form an insecure attachment with our caretaker. That leads us to develop emotional regulation problems and negative models for conflict resolution. So it all kind of intertwines. You'll notice that these theories kind of overlap, and you can see where some of these are really consistent with the other. So it's really on us, right? This is where prevention is so important. And we got to understand, right? Who who are the caretakers caring for these infants and what needs do they have, right? It's all well and good to want to focus our efforts on the next generation, and the next generation is going to end domestic violence and all of that. But we can't neglect too, right? Kids are growing up with family members, with community members, with neighbors, family, friends, peers who might not have the benefit of knowing this stuff or having some prevention work in place. So it's really, we really have to focus on efforts on everyone in society too. Then this graphic I really loved, so I decided to put it in here. This was taken from the Blue Shield of California Foundation. They do really good work and research around intimate partner violence. And I really like this graphic because it depicts this, these factors that we tend to think of when we see, you know, a violent act occur, or, you know, we see a case of domestic violence in the news, or it comes across our desks, right? A victim calls us. And it's usually, we tend to focus on the situational factors, right? You know, what argument happened? Oh, this person has an anger issue. Oh, you know, what were the tactics of abuse? Oh, this person had an alcohol problem. And that's usually what when we zoom in on, when we look at these cases, and we kind of neglect the other factors that are equally as important to understand. So that's why I like this graphic, is like, it's not a hierarchy. It's not like a 1, 2, 3. It's nested. These are nested factors that kind of blend and like go together. Give it like a Russian nesting doll, if you will. So in this model, right, situational factors at the individual level, right, like alcohol abuse, for example, those can contribute to violence. Absolutely, that could be a risk factor, but they're often influenced by other intermediate life course and developmental factors, right? Like child trauma, or structural and cultural factors too, like unhealthy forms of masculinity. So if I grew up, right, in an abusive home, right, that would be a life course factor. I learned, right, as a man, or as, you know, a male, to express my masculinity in a certain way. Usually that's not a healthy form. And I've learned to use violence to get what I want, or to resolve any conflicts. Add to it, right, the way I've been coping with my childhood abuse with alcohol. All those things you can now see, right? It's a blend of these factors. Now that gives rise to those domestic violence incidents. So we really got to zoom out, if you will, as advocates and as people, you know, trying to end these issues in our society, and not focus too much on the situational factors. Yes, they do contribute in the moment, but what are the bigger factors that we're missing that also contribute to violence in our society? It's not all bad news, I should say. There's a lot of protective factors out there, a lot of good research that's been done that say, you know, having these factors in place acts as protections in many cases. Those being having strong social support and a sense of cohesion and connection within your community. I've said this before in some of the trauma trainings I've done, where trauma is isolation, right? That's kind of the big characteristic of trauma, is having the sense or feeling isolated. So what is the antidote to that, right? Is cohesion and connection with others and with people we care about, and with advocates and those in our community. Having that strong social support is really, really important. But also having strong familial and community resilience. So when bad things happen, when disaster strikes, when, you know, there's a pandemic going around, we are able to back. We're there for our neighbor. We're there to help out. We connect with the people we care about. We check in with one another, and we really fall back, right, on our resiliency. But also too, right, something we all can do, especially if you have kids of your own, is really having that safe, stable, and nurturing relationship between intimate partners and children. Goes back to that attachment theory and social learning theory, where kids grow up and they watch what we do. They watch the words we say and the language we use and how we treat one another. So it's really important to have that stability, that safety, that nurturing relationship between yourself and your kiddos, to really ensure, right, that they grow up thinking, hey, This is what a healthy relationship and family dynamic is. All right. Now, I mentioned at the beginning what our mission statement is, and I kind of wanted to clarify that here. So all those theories that I just talked about and we know domestic violence and sexual violence are upheld by systemic and institutionalized oppression, right? Where things like nativism, ableism, all our isms, right? Homophobia, classism, racism, heteronormativity, all these things really are like the foundation to these forms of violence in our society. We really uphold it. And we know that we can't end one form of violence without ending all forms of violence. And if we want to really end intimate partner violence and sexual assault in our country, in our society, we really have to grapple with the legacy and the history of racism, colonialism, genocide, all those things that founded our country. If we go back to, its origins, we have to understand that and really reckon with what we've done as a country to certain groups of people to really get to a place where we're able to dismantle those systems and then hopefully end domestic and sexual violence. Also, take a look at how we think about or talk about domestic violence in our culture, right? And pop culture, if you will. So I have here some of the more popular social media sites or platforms that some of us or most of us use. And I have here some examples of some victim blaming type tweets that I found. The Baltimore Ravens, some of you might remember the Ray Rice incident that happened a few years ago. The Baltimore Ravens, right, the employer of Ray Rice said that Janae Rice, the victim in this case, says she deeply regrets the role that she played the night of the incident, right? How victim blaming is that? Mr. Paul George over here said, I don't condone hitting women or think it's cool, but if she ain't chirping, then I ain't chirping. Let's keep it moving, let that man play. This was in reference to another NFL incident where a player was arrested for domestic violence. And here, I don't believe Amber, in reference to Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. The night of the assault, cops were called and they didn't see any sign of abuse. She just wants money. Hashtag I'm with Johnny. So again, some examples, I'm sure there are many more out there that illustrate, right, what victims see, what people who cause harm are seeing, what children are seeing in reference to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Another example, right, some of you might have remembered this controversial ad that occurred a few years ago where Snapchat put up an ad for this, game, the Would You Rather game. And, what are the two options here? Slap Rihanna or punch Chris Brown. For those of you who aren't familiar, Rihanna and Chris Brown had there was abuse in that relationship. Chris Brown abused Rihanna. There was, very well documented photos and information that came from the night where she was assaulted pretty badly. And Rihanna actually, when this ad came out, she was very vocal and said, how insensitive is this? For a lot of survivors of domestic violence, this is kind of you're minimizing what we've gone through. And it's not just ads, it's not just tweets, it's memes. We make memes out of it. We think it's funny. In a sense, we're trivializing some of these very serious issues in our society where, people are killed daily by, intimate partners and family members, but we make a joke out of it, right? We share it, we tweet it, we DM it to people, we think it's funny, we comment, and it's still happening to this day. The rightmost meme that I found, the punching bag one, I found last year, right? 2019, I found this. So it's not gotten any better, unfortunately, but it's on us, right? What we choose to consume, what's going out there, what we're sharing, what our kids are watching and seeing. But unfortunately, right, that's the reality in our, today's age, is that this stuff is continuing to happen. This is how we're talking about these subjects. it's not just, right, memes and tweets and ads. It's also in our music, and I have here some examples of some problematic, right, lyrics and songs and music videos, but also it happens in our reality TV and our video games and our sports. All these things where violence is now just a way, it's entertaining, right? It's entertainment at this point. It's commercialized, right? A lot of people can profit off of making, or adding violence to your games, to your shows. It's something we can profit off of, make a lot of money for. So it's everywhere, right? It's in every domain of our society where violence is occurring. We've gotten to that point, right, where we've normalized violence. It's become something like as American as pie. But what can we do to interrupt that, right? What can we do to, maybe do better and consume our media in a different way? Or to really be just aware of these issues going on, what we're consuming in day to day. All right, so let's talk about why don't they just leave? I'm sure you all have heard this statement before. Why didn't they leave? Why did they stay? And we know we don't like this question. We don't like it being asked. But I wanted to highlight some of the barriers that a lot of survivors have to deal with or have to overcome in order to get safe and to escape an abusive relationship. So I have here a list of just some barriers to leaving an abusive relationship. I will say money and housing still continue to be the top 2 reasons why someone might stay in an abusive relationship. In Arizona specifically, we know, for context, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, they do a census every year. For a 24-hour period, they survey all domestic violence programs in the country to kind of understand what needs survivors have, who are we serving, how many people are being served, and housing, time and time again, I think for the past 3 years now, remains to be the top need that survivors have. There's just no affordable housing out there. There's, it's more rare, right, to qualify and to be eligible for these things. Shelter space is declining, right? It's very hard to get into shelter nowadays, right? Bed space is at capacity every day. And housing is just getting more expensive. It's out of reach for a lot of folks. It's becoming something they can't afford. But other things besides money and housing, right? Having a child or being pregnant, right? Children, it makes it much, much harder to leave an abusive relationship when there's children involved. Maybe your employment, right, is on the line, or you've already been written up, right? And you don't want to lose your job, right? Lack of resources, lack of social support. If you have a disability, right? If your caretaker is also your abuser, that's a really tricky dynamic too. Maybe your culture or religion is a barrier in many cases, right? Where they, don't condone you separating from your family or your spouse. There might be a big fear of police or authority, right? Especially in certain, Black and brown communities, right? And Native communities. There's a big, big fear of police and authority for very good reason, where, police aren't seen as helpful, or if I call the police, I might be in more danger. So it's really important we understand those dynamics too. Maybe the geography of where you're living. You live in a very rural part of the state. There's no bus lines, cell signal is really shoddy. There isn't a shelter near you, or the closest advocate is, miles away. That can pose a really big barrier for you too. We talked about pets, how sometimes they can be a barrier to leaving. If I know I have to leave them behind and they might be killed or injured, I might think twice. Maybe your legal status, if you're undocumented, and maybe your partner is holding that against you or is threatening to call, to get you deported, all those things. We know too, some of the most dangerous times for a survivor is when they've made the decision to leave that relationship. We know abuse escalates during those times. So a survivor might have tried before to leave their partner and experienced like more abuse during that time. So they might know, hey, if I try to leave again, these things might happen to me. So they might want to avoid that from happening. A partner might promise, you know, hey, I'll, you know, go to therapy, I'll find Jesus, I'll go to AA, you know, I'll quit this behavior. But we know, right, accountability works. True accountability is very different than just making a promise. So, you know, a person might believe, right, okay, this person will go to therapy, you know, their violent behavior will end. And that's okay to believe those promises. It's not okay to break those promises, right? Where now you're choosing not to continue that healthy behavior. It might be very complicated, right? Where if your partner is law enforcement or a pastor or someone who's really well known in your community, right? Well respected. Maybe they're the chief of something, or they're philanthropist who does a lot of good community work. That could really complicate, right? Making these allegations that this person's also abusing you. Complicated systems. We know our systems are not so friendly to survivors. Going down to court and getting an order of protection, going down to apply for food stamps and getting all that worked out, getting unemployment, all those things can be very, very complicated for people. So that might be something that's a barrier in and of themselves. Maybe, and this goes back to advocates too, how complicated is our system? Where, you know, if I'm a survivor and I have to seek safety, is it complicated for me to get safe, right? To call an advocate, to get support? How many barriers are in the way for me to do that? We know confusion and trauma, right? Those things are very real and take a really big toll on a person's thinking, their mental health, their emotional state. And those things can be barriers in and of themselves to leaving or to taking action. And then fear and shame and love and attachment, right? Those are also very big reasons why a person might stay in their relationship. They might be afraid to leave, or they might still really love their person, their partner, and be really attached to them and really hopeful that things might change. And again, as advocates, we are not here to judge why a person relationship. We might not know all the reasons or the subtleties, right, as to why this person's staying. Our job is to be non-judgmental, right, withhold our judgment, not to assume things, and to be ready to support that person at every time, right? So to kind of make this clearer, we know leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous times for victims. So, you know, if we ask ourselves or we ask this person, why are you staying? Why don't you just leave, right? As if it's something you can do pretty easily, right? We're asking people to put themselves in dangerous way, right? To really be more vulnerable in this time of their lives, right? If we assume these things are easy when really they're not, and we assume that they're going to be okay when we don't know that, right? We know, you know, this is the most dangerous times for people. So really checking ourselves, I guess, as advocates and understanding that these things are not simple. And again, right, leaving isn't an event. It is a process. It takes time. And as advocates, it's going to take patience on our end to stand by that survivor and to be ready to help them when they feel ready to leave. A person might leave their relationship, right, 6-7 times before they leave for good. And a lot of us, I can tell right away when advocates are really burnt out is when they, you know, oh, she went back, or oh man, he believed her, he's back with her. That's a very big sign, right? Something's up with our advocacy if we're not being if we're being judgmental in that way. So really it takes a lot of patience on our behalf, really understanding that leaving is not an event, right? It is a process. It's gonna take time. And I wanted to highlight some victim blaming statements. So if you've heard one of these before, feel free to throw it in the chat, or maybe your own victim blaming examples that you have. But things like, oh, well, you must like it. Why did you stay? Or did you do something that could have been misinterpreted? Did you ask them to stop? Right? That's so condescending. Or you need to be more assertive, right? Something with you. Why did you go back? Well, why don't you just call the cops, right? Or how could you let them treat you like this? You're smarter than this. We raised you better than this. Or why do you keep believing them? So some of you might have some other examples. We hear this time and time again, right? You might have heard this from, yeah, it could have been worse. What?
Why'd you poke the bear?
Oh, why'd you poke the bear? That's a good one. So all these, right, are examples of placing the responsibility on the victim in some way, right? That they did something, they didn't do something to avoid, this from happening or to cause this. We really want to get away from these kind of statements because they are very hurtful. They don't open up the door, right, to good advocacy. They don't. If I were to hear this, right, as a survivor, I would not think the person asking or telling me this was someone that could help me, right? I want to see you as a good advocate if you ask me some of these things. So really being aware of what language we're using, what thoughts and belief systems we have. Unfortunately, these things get said all the time and usually by friends and family, right? People that we think are there to support us and be there for us. We fall into these traps. So I really urge you, if you're interested, to join us for the end of April, where we're going to have a victim blaming webinar, where we really dive deep into why we make these comments and how we can avoid them. All right. Now, to end us off, I wanted to talk about working with those who do harm. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, right, when we talked about who perpetrators are, the perpetrators do deserve and need support and intervention, right? As a movement, we've done great work working with victims, but we've been really reactive to violence, right, and to intimate partner violence. It's really on us to also incorporate and collaborate with those who have previously done harm, who've done accountability work, right, to stop that behavior, to engage, right, with those who do harm and continue to do harm, right? This movement can't be one-sided, right? We'll never end domestic violence that way. So this is more of a call to action to really understand that if we want to do good work, if we want to be successful in these efforts, we have to work with those who do harm, right? Ending domestic violence requires us to do that. We know that when a crime is committed, there's lots of people that are harmed, right? Not just the victim. We know the perpetrator is also harmed in some way, and the community at large too. We suffer when people are, convicted of crimes, and when our neighbors go to jail, and when, kids aren't without their parents. The community at large suffers too. And we know that incarceration doesn't fix everything. Strictly punishing domestic violence with incarceration does nothing to end it. We're doing some work talking about mass incarceration and what accountability looks like for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And incarceration is a band-aid, unfortunately, right? It doesn't involve true accountability, and it doesn't involve transforming lives. Again, it's just a band-aid that we put on the issue, thinking that it's going to fix it, but it does nothing to end it. We also have to recognize and accept that people who cause harm are whole, complex human beings who are capable of change and growth, right? If we can believe that a survivor endured the most terrible abuse out there and is able and capable of healing, we can still accept and recognize that people who cause harm and who inflict some of these terrible abuse and violence are also capable of growing and changing too. And in order to prevent intimate partner violence, we have to also include conversations about racism, sexism, colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy, right? These things don't happen in a vacuum, right? We've come to this point in our society due to legacy and history of our country, and what other forms of institutional and structural violence exists. So we really have to have those conversations if we're going to be able to do good work around people who are causing harm. We know that just like there's no one version of safety for all survivors, there's going to be no one solution for people who do harm, right? We talk about safety planning being, right, individualized and contextual, right? It has to meet the needs of the survivor. So does, of any good intervention program for people who do harm, right? It has to be individualized and in the context of their lives, what their needs are. So for those of you out there who are advocates, maybe you're not in a position right now to work with offenders or work with people who cause harm, but you might be working with a survivor one day who says, I want my partner to go to offender treatment, or I want them to get intervention. Cool. As advocates, we got to roll with it, right? We want to support that person. So we should be able to understand what good partner violence intervention programs are out there and what they should include. So the best intervention programs are flexible and they're customized to address the needs of the whole family. They also have to be accessible. No, a lot of places offer treatment groups for offenders, but they're really expensive, or they're just inaccessible, right? They're in the middle of the day. They don't offer childcare, all those things. So they should be as affordable as possible and stigma-free. And they should serve those who want to voluntarily participate as well as those who are court mandated. We shouldn't come to, and I hate this about, the way we set up these intervention programs is that we have to wait for a judge to order it for people to attend it. And that shouldn't be the case, right? If you understand that you have an issue and you're not treating your partner the way you should be, I shouldn't have to get to that point where now I'm being charged with something, or I'm now interacting with the criminal legal system to be able to participate in those programs, right? If I understand, it's kind of like, the recovery model, right? Where I shouldn't have to, overdose for me to get help. I should be able to recognize that, hey, something's not right, and be able to get the help I need before it gets to that point. It should also create community among participants in a way that fosters mentoring relationships and shared values, accountability, and goals. It's very different, right? Where, if I attend a support group or like an intervention program where I have to do these classes now, and all the participants believe the same thing, hate going, they resent, the judge that sent them there. It should really be about participants who are able to mentor each other and keep each other accountable, right? Where, hey, you made that comment, that wasn't cool. Be able to check each other that way. It should also facilitate partnerships with others to meet that person's mental health, addiction, housing, education, and economic needs. Again, right? Just as survivors are not one-dimensional, perpetrators are not one-dimensional, right? They have needs besides, right, the violence that's occurring or the violence that they're perpetrating. They might be homeless, right? They might be struggling to find a job, and that might be exacerbating the violence that they're choosing to use. So we got to address that too. And then the best partner violence intervention programs promote personal transformation and healing instead of shame, blame, or punishment. Shaming someone, blaming someone, punishing someone for their behavior does nothing to add or create true accountability. It creates resentment. It creates, this false idea that we're fixing something when we're not. So the best intervention programs really do promote transforming people and really changing their belief systems, changing their behavior, and healing some of the stuff that they've gone through. If we go back to a few slides ago when I talked about how one of the biggest predictors of violence is having survived it. So we know a lot of the people who are out here, committing violent crimes are survivors themselves in some way. And really understanding that dynamic gives us a little bit more awareness, I guess, as to what their needs are, right? If we want to stop these issues from happening in our society, we want people to be safe, we gotta get people to heal, right? And heal from the trauma that they've gone through. So let's shift the paradigm, right? We gotta shift from individual responsibility, right, to community accountability. It takes all of us. We all play a role in ending domestic and sexual violence. We have to expect more from each other. We have to recognize too the ways society has given men permission to abuse. I talked about though at the beginning that domestic violence is not gender equal, right? It does happen to more women than it does to men, and men are incarcerated for domestic violence crimes much higher, much more than women are. So we really have to understand what in our society has given men permission to be this way. It really does take a whole community to make change. Really getting away from, oh, my neighbors are dealing with this, that's a family issue, that doesn't affect me. Yes, it does, right? We're going to grow up and see the children of your neighbors, right, who are struggling with domestic violence, grow up and do these same kind of behaviors, and these cycles continue. So it really takes the whole community to make that change. And true accountability requires acknowledging what we've done and the impact it had on others, expressing remorse, genuine remorse, taking actions to right the wrongs defined by those we harmed, right? They get to decide how to right those wrongs. And we have to commit to never doing this action again. So another way to look at it is that when we hurt someone, we owe something, right? I think of, domestic violence or any crime, right, as being a violation, right? And that violation now transforms into an obligation where I am now obligated to mend that relationship, to make and repair that harm that I've committed.
I just wanted to say that there's a couple really good programs in Arizona that's at the top of our list. One is the Emerge in Tucson, has a really good program for people who do harm. Call down there and talk to them, and they'll tell you how they do their program. And Chrysalis has a really good program for domestic violence offenders. So check those out and get some information if you're interested in beefing up your outreach in your community, or want to explore the possibility of having services for people who do harm.
And I think we threw those in the chat box too, so you have them. But they're out there, and that's the point, I think, is that we have a long ways to go though in Arizona to really shift and understand true accountability and good accountability, and have more options for people who are offending and perpetrating these crimes. But there is good work being done out there already. All right, we made it to the end, folks. So remember, as we wrap up, domestic violence is very nuanced. And I mentioned at the beginning that this is a beginner kind of foundation to understanding dynamics of domestic violence. And I hope you can see, right, there's a lot of areas we still didn't cover, and a lot of things we missed, or just for time's sake we didn't have time to cover. But I want you to really understand that domestic violence is nuanced. There are many, it's very complex. It's a complex issue in our society. It's not as simple as we tend to think it is. And so our approach to domestic violence has to be as complex as the issue is. Leaving an abusive relationship is never easy and can actually be more dangerous. I really want you all to understand that. It goes kind of in line with avoiding victim blaming statements. And we know that ending violence in our society does take work at the individual, community, and structural levels, right? It's not an individual problem. It's not a family issue. it's a community problem, and it's going to take structural change and policy decisions to help people be safe and to facilitate more of that accountability and prevention work and all of that that's really involved in ending these issues in our society. So as promised, I wanted to talk about our contact information. It's on here on the screen if you'd like to get a hold of us. Again, my name is Ruby. I have Doreen with me and Sam also, who've been really active on the chat box, so I appreciate both of them.